Ellen Wilson, 72 years old, had always been the heart of her family. She was the one who welcomed every holiday with open arms, the one who kept the house warm, and the one who, for decades, had supported her children with nothing more than the love she could give. But things had changed. It had been a slow and subtle shift, like the slow erosion of a cliffside. First, the whispers behind her back, then the icy stares, and finally, the betrayal. On that fateful afternoon, it all came crashing down. She had always been there for her son, Brian. He was her pride and joy, the one who had promised to care for her in her old age. But today, he wasn't the man she thought he was. Ellen had been locked in the dog shed in the backyard, the cold steel door pressing against her skin, and her son's words echoing in her ears. "Sign the inheritance papers, Mom, or stay in here forever." Brian had grown up spoiled and entitled. Ellen had worked her entire life to provide for him and his siblings, never once asking for anything in return. And now, the very son she had raised had abandoned her in the coldest, most heartless way possible. She could feel the sting of betrayal deep in her heart, but she also knew one thing. She wasn't broken. Not yet. Not ever. Brian thought she'd crumble under the weight of his threats. He thought that being left in the dog shed with only the cold wind and the scent of mildew for company would break her spirit. But Ellen had something else in mind. The papers that Brian had left for her to sign were nothing more than a ploy to rob her of everything she had worked for. The family home, her savings, her legacy. All of it would go to him if she complied. But what Brian didn't know was that Ellen had already been preparing for a moment like this. For years, she had kept a secret, a small thread of her strength that he had no idea existed. As the cold seeped into her bones, Ellen made her decision. With shaking hands, she grabbed the pen he had left for her and wrote something down, but not what he had expected. "I signed," she whispered to herself, "but not in the way he thinks." Her heart pounded with a mix of fear and determination. It wasn't just a signature on a piece of paper. This was her declaration of war. Ellen didn't just sign her name. She signed the beginning of her redemption. Brian was going to pay for underestimating her. But how would she make him pay? That, she hadn't decided yet. As the door of the shed creaked open and Brian's voice called out to her from the darkness, Ellen stood up slowly, the ink on the paper drying in her hand. "Mom," he said smugly, "did you sign? We can move forward now." Her eyes narrowed as she looked at her son, a twisted smile creeping across her face. "Oh, Brian, you have no idea what I've just done." And with that, the door slammed shut behind her, leaving a trail of uncertainty hanging in the air. What had she signed? What was her plan? You'll have to wait to find out. Ellen sat in the dim, cramped dog shed, the walls closing in around her as she replayed the events of the day. Her fingers still trembled from the writing she had just done. It wasn't like her. Ellen Wilson was a woman who had spent her life as the quiet, stoic matriarch of the family, the one who always took the high road, the one who never raised her voice in anger. But Brian's betrayal had shattered her calm. She had always protected him, always shielded him from the hard truths of life. She had worked tirelessly to ensure that he never wanted for anything. Yet here he was, a man who had no qualms about locking his own mother in the dog shed, demanding that she hand over everything she had worked for. Her mind raced. How had things gone so wrong? She thought back to the early years when she and her husband, Henry, had struggled to make ends meet. The nights spent scrimping and saving, the long hours she worked as a nurse to provide for her family. It hadn't been glamorous, but it had been enough. She had poured her heart and soul into raising Brian, guiding him, teaching him right from wrong. She'd never expected that one day she would be treated like a burden, an inconvenience, a pawn in her son's greedy game. The tears she had held back for years threatened to spill, but Ellen would not cry. Not today. Not when she had a plan, a glimmer of hope that things could still be set right. The sound of footsteps outside the shed brought her back to reality. Brian was approaching, his heavy boots crunching the gravel. He had come back to check on her, to see if she would break. But Ellen wasn't about to give him the satisfaction. She steadied herself, taking a deep breath. The air in the shed was musty, but there was something else now, something powerful. It was the feeling of her own resolve. As the door opened, Brian's face appeared in the doorway. His eyes were filled with smugness, a look of victory on his face. "Well, Mom, did you sign it?" he asked, his voice dripping with arrogance. Ellen didn't answer him right away. Instead, she stood up slowly, her old bones creaking as she straightened herself. She had nothing to lose anymore. If her son thought he had won, he was about to find out just how wrong he was. Her heart was pounding in her chest, but she kept her voice steady, calm. "I signed, Brian, but not the way you think." Brian's expression faltered for a moment, confusion clouding his face. He stepped forward, holding out the envelope. "What are you talking about? You signed the papers, right? That means I get everything." Ellen's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. She had waited years for this moment. The moment when she would finally stand up for herself, when she would stop being a silent bystander in her own life. "I signed," she repeated, her voice low, steady, and dangerous. "But I didn't sign away anything, Brian. I didn't give you a single thing." Brian's eyebrows furrowed in disbelief. He glanced down at the papers in his hands, flipping through them quickly. "What do you mean? This is all in order. I'm getting everything. This house, the money, everything you've worked for." Ellen stepped forward, her presence commanding. "No, Brian, you're wrong. You may have thought you had me locked away, that I would sign those papers and leave everything to you. But you underestimated me." Brian's eyes narrowed, his smugness turning to frustration. "You're old, Mom. You're past your prime. What are you going to do? You can't stop me." Ellen met his gaze with a quiet strength. "I'm not trying to stop you, Brian. I'm just not going to play by your rules anymore." She stepped back, pulling the crumpled piece of paper from her pocket. Brian's eyes widened as he saw what she had done. It wasn't the inheritance papers. It was something else entirely, something that would change everything. Brian's mouth went dry as he realized what she had signed. "You wouldn't," he whispered. Ellen's smile deepened. "You're about to find out just how much I would." The tension in the air was thick. Brian stood frozen, the weight of his mother's words sinking in. He had thought that locking her away would force her to comply. But Ellen was not a woman who could be easily controlled. And now, she had the upper hand. She had signed the papers, yes, but not the ones Brian had expected. Instead, she had signed a document that would strip him of the control he thought he had over her life. It was the one thing he had overlooked, the one thing he had failed to notice in his blind greed. The piece of paper in her hand was a deed, transferring ownership of the house and all of her assets to someone else. And it wasn't Brian. The silence between them stretched for what felt like an eternity. Then Brian's voice broke through, trembling with fury. "You did this behind my back? You've got no right to." "I have every right, Brian," Ellen interrupted, her voice cutting through his anger like a knife. "This is my life, and I've worked for every bit of it. You don't get to take it from me." With one final, defiant look, Ellen turned her back on her son and walked out of the shed. Brian stood there, dumbfounded, as she closed the door behind her. She had done it. She had taken control of her life again. But the question now was, what would she do with it? Ellen's heart was pounding as she walked away from the shed, the weight of what she had just done settling in. She wasn't sure what had come over her in that moment, whether it was the years of silent suffering or the long-buried rage that had finally found its voice. But for the first time in years, Ellen felt alive. Not in the way that joy or love made her feel, but with a kind of raw, unfiltered power. She had just taken control of her life again. And yet, as she made her way through the yard, she could hear Brian's voice ringing in her ears. "You can't do this. This is my house now." The words felt like poison, and Ellen wasn't about to let them define her. The cool air stung her cheeks as she walked down the path, the familiar house looming in front of her. Her house. The one she had built with her own hands, the one where she had raised her children, nurtured their dreams, and fought through the hardships of life. Brian had come to believe it was his by birthright, but Ellen knew better. She had built this place on love, sacrifice, and hard work. And no matter what he thought, she wasn't going to let him take it from her. Inside the house, the silence felt suffocating. Ellen's footsteps echoed in the empty hallway as she made her way to the kitchen, her fingers brushing the countertops, the same ones she had wiped clean for years. The same ones that had held family meals, tears, and laughter. The same ones she had always shared with her children. She didn't want to cry, but the tears came anyway. Not for what she had lost, but for what Brian had taken from her all these years. Her trust, her peace, her quiet love. He had turned everything they had shared into a transaction. And now, she would make sure he would never forget what it meant to betray his own mother. Ellen grabbed a glass of water from the counter and took a deep, steadying breath. There was no time to waste. The papers she had signed weren't just a piece of revenge. They were a lifeline. She had made sure of that. What Brian didn't know was that in the midst of his greed, he had overlooked the very thing that would be his undoing. The deed she had signed was more than a mere transfer of property. It was a strategic move, a trap that would lead Brian straight into a situation he couldn't wriggle out of. She had learned a long time ago that in order to fight the battle, you had to understand the game being played. And Brian, with all his arrogance and entitlement, had been so sure of his win that he had missed the crucial detail. Ellen had transferred everything to her late husband's estate. But it wasn't just the house. It was the entire financial portfolio that Brian had never even considered. It was all tied up in trusts and funds that could not be accessed without a series of court orders. Brian thought he could steal from her by using her signature, but he had no idea that Ellen had set up a failsafe all those years ago. Now, the game was about to change. Ellen didn't have much time. Brian would be back soon, his anger boiling over now that he realized he'd been duped. But Ellen wasn't afraid. The battle was far from over, and she would be ready for whatever came next. She made a call, one she'd been putting off for years. The number she dialed wasn't one she wanted to reach, but it was the only way forward. A trusted lawyer from years ago who had helped Henry with some of the estate planning. Ellen didn't want to make this call, but there was no turning back now. As the phone rang, Ellen stared out the window at the sun setting behind the trees, the golden light casting a quiet glow on the yard. It was a moment of peace before the storm she knew was coming. She could hear Brian's voice in her head again, taunting her, calling her weak, calling her old. He had thought he could break her. But Ellen knew one thing. He had underestimated her. The phone finally clicked, and the voice on the other end answered. Ellen didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I need your help," she said, her voice firm and steady. "I've got a situation, and I need it handled. Now." The lawyer paused. "What happened, Mrs. Wilson?" "I need to put a stop to something, and I need it done legally. Brian's trying to take everything I've worked for, and I've made a move, but it's not enough. I need to hit him where it hurts." The lawyer's voice became serious. "Understood. Let's meet tomorrow, and we'll sort this out. But you need to be careful, Mrs. Wilson. This could get ugly." Ellen didn't hesitate. "I've been careful my whole life. This time, I'm fighting back." She hung up the phone and walked back toward the living room, her gaze landing on the old family photo album on the coffee table. It had been there for years, the pictures of her children, their smiles frozen in time. Ellen's heart twisted as she thought about the little boy who once clung to her for comfort. Now, that boy had turned into a man she didn't even recognize. She had tried to do right by him, to show him the world through the eyes of kindness and sacrifice. But Brian had chosen greed over everything she had taught him. Now, she would show him what happens when you underestimate a woman who has nothing left to lose. Her fingers hovered over the album, but instead of opening it, she slammed it shut. She wasn't going to live in the past anymore. Not when she had the chance to rewrite her future. The clock was ticking. And Brian was about to realize that his mother was no longer the quiet woman in the background. He was about to learn what it truly meant to face Ellen Wilson. The next morning, Ellen stood at the front door, the faint smell of coffee brewing in the kitchen filling the air. The house, once a place of warmth and laughter, now felt like a battleground. Her hands were steady, but her mind was racing. She knew that time was running out. Brian would be back soon, he had to be. The last thing he wanted was for her to have any control over her own life. But this wasn't about control anymore. This was about justice. About making sure that no one, especially not her own son, could walk all over her again. Ellen had spent the morning preparing, gathering her thoughts and piecing together the final details of the plan she had set in motion. She'd given Brian no reason to believe she'd outsmarted him. To him, she was just a frail old woman who didn't understand the rules of the game. But Brian didn't know the lengths to which Ellen had gone to ensure he wouldn't win. It wasn't just the transfer of the estate. No, Ellen had been much more thorough. She'd made sure that everything was locked down tight, from the house itself to every single penny she'd worked for over the years. It had all been carefully put into irrevocable trusts that Brian could never access without serious consequences. And he had no idea that, by trying to force her into signing the inheritance papers, he'd just set off a chain reaction that would unravel everything he thought he had won. The doorbell rang, pulling Ellen from her thoughts. She didn't need to check who it was. She knew exactly who it was. Brian. His impatience would have driven him here early. He needed answers, and he wasn't going to get the ones he was expecting. Ellen opened the door, and there he was. The son who had once been her pride and joy, now standing before her with a look of anger and frustration on his face. His eyes narrowed when he saw her calm demeanor. "You signed," he said, his voice tight. "So, what's all this about? What did you do?" Ellen stepped aside, motioning for him to enter. She had already made the decision to face him head-on. There was no running from this anymore. "You don't understand, Brian," she said quietly, shutting the door behind him. "What I signed yesterday was just the beginning." Brian's jaw tightened. "Don't play games with me. You think I don't know what you're trying to pull? I saw the papers." Ellen's lips curved slightly. "You saw what you wanted to see, but there's a lot more to this than you think." Brian stepped forward, eyes blazing. "Enough of this. I'm not leaving until I get what's mine, Mom. You think you can outsmart me? I've been planning this for years. And now, you're going to give me everything I'm owed." Ellen's heart tightened, but her voice was firm. "What you think you're owed, Brian, isn't yours to take. Not anymore." The air between them crackled with tension. Brian's face reddened with fury. "This is all a game to you, isn't it? You think you can play with me like a child, but I'm not your little boy anymore. You'll regret this." Ellen took a deep breath. "I don't think you realize how much you've underestimated me." Brian scoffed, turning his back on her. "Underestimated you? You're an old woman. What could you possibly do to stop me?" Ellen's eyes followed him as he paced in the living room, her hands clenched at her sides.
"He still thinks I'm weak."
"He still thinks I'm nothing." The phone on the kitchen counter rang, breaking the silence. Ellen didn't flinch, didn't even glance toward it. She had already made her move, and now, it was time to let everything fall into place. Brian looked over his shoulder, seeing her calm composure, and something in his face shifted. "Who's that? Another lawyer? You think I'm scared of your games? I'm done playing by your rules." Ellen smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was cold and sharp, like a blade just before it struck. "You should be scared, Brian. You should be very scared. That's why I'm calling my lawyer." Brian froze. His eyes widened with confusion.
"What?"
"You're not going to." But Ellen was already walking toward the phone, picking it up and placing it to her ear. She looked back at Brian, whose expression now shifted to one of growing panic. The voice on the other end was steady. "Mrs. Wilson, we're ready to proceed. The paperwork is in order, and we can move forward with the legal filings at your discretion. Your son won't be able to touch any of the assets. The trust is airtight." Brian's face went pale as he realized what was happening. He had underestimated Ellen at every turn. She wasn't just signing papers. She was making sure he would never have access to her hard-earned legacy. "You're ruining everything," Brian shouted, his fists clenched. "This is my inheritance. You can't just—" "Actually, I can," Ellen interrupted, her voice calm but firm. "You may have thought I was weak, Brian, but it turns out I was just waiting for the right moment." Brian's anger flared, but his body language had changed. He was no longer the confident, entitled son he had been just a day ago. Now he was a man on the verge of losing everything. Ellen could see it in his eyes. He was starting to understand just how deep this betrayal ran. The phone call ended, and Ellen placed the receiver back in its cradle. She walked toward Brian slowly, the weight of her words settling between them like a storm cloud. "You don't get to decide when I give up, Brian," she said, her voice steady. "You don't get to take everything I've worked for just because you think you can intimidate me." Brian took a step back, his face red with frustration and shame. He had no control anymore. He was losing everything. He had tried to break her, but now he realized that she had built something stronger than he could ever destroy. Ellen stood tall, watching him, a sense of peace settling over her. She had done it. She had taken back what was hers. And just as she felt a wave of victory, she saw it. Brian's eyes narrowed, his anger building once more. He wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. The sun had barely risen the next day when Ellen received an unexpected visitor. The night had been long and filled with restless thoughts, but she had managed to sleep in the comfort of knowing that she was finally on the right side of things. Brian might have thought he was in control, but Ellen had carefully plotted every step in this chess game, and now she was several moves ahead. The knock on the door came just as she finished her breakfast. It was sharp and insistent, the kind of knock that made you feel like something important was about to happen. Ellen set her mug down carefully, her fingers brushing the edge. She had already known this moment would come. After all, Brian wouldn't give up that easily. She walked to the door, her steps measured, and opened it. Standing there was a man she hadn't seen in years, but his face was all too familiar. Gerald, her late husband's closest friend, and the executor of his will. Ellen's breath caught in her throat as she saw him standing there, his dark eyes filled with an uncomfortable urgency. He had always been the calm one in their friendship, the one who'd helped Henry with all the legal matters, the one who had kept the family safe when things got tough. But now, the expression on his face was anything but calm. "Mrs. Wilson," Gerald said with a solemn bow of his head. "I'm afraid we need to talk." Ellen stepped aside and allowed him in, her mind already racing with possibilities. What could he possibly be here for? After all, she had already ensured her legal matters were settled, the estate in her control, and Brian left with nothing. "I know you're probably wondering what this is about," Gerald continued, his voice low and almost hesitant. "But I've just received a call from Brian." Ellen's eyes narrowed. Brian? What more could he want? He had already done everything he could to get his hands on her money, and now that she had thwarted him, he seemed desperate. But she wasn't about to let him win this time. "He's threatening legal action," Gerald continued, his eyes avoiding hers. "He says that you're trying to keep everything for yourself, and that the transfer of assets was improper." Ellen let out a short laugh. Improper? She had worked with the utmost care to ensure that everything she'd done was above board. Improper? She repeated, shaking her head. "Gerald, I've done nothing illegal. Everything is legally sound. Brian just doesn't like the fact that I've taken control back of my own life." Gerald seemed uncomfortable, but he wasn't done. "I know, Mrs. Wilson, and I trust you. But Brian, he's threatened to go public with this. He says he's got proof that you manipulated the system." Ellen's jaw clenched. Manipulated the system? Her son was so deep in his own lies that he couldn't even see the truth anymore. "Proof," Ellen repeated, her voice now sharp. "What kind of proof?" Gerald hesitated for a moment, then pulled out a folder from under his arm. It was thick, bulging with documents. He placed it carefully on the table in front of her. "These are the documents Brian has threatened to use. He's hired a lawyer, and he's ready to take you to court. He says if you don't back down, he'll expose everything." Ellen stared at the folder in silence. This wasn't just about her house anymore. This was about her life's work, her legacy. And Brian was willing to throw all of that away to get his hands on it. She opened the folder slowly, scanning through the documents. Her eyes flicked back and forth across the pages, reading quickly, her pulse quickening with every word. And then she found it, the one thing that made her stomach drop. There, among the papers, was a forged signature. A document that she knew for certain she had never signed. It was dated just a few weeks ago. And there, in the corner, was the unmistakable mark of Brian's scheming hand. The realization hit her like a slap in the face. Brian had forged her signature, and now he was using that forged document to try and manipulate the legal system to his advantage. He wasn't just trying to take her house, he was trying to ruin her completely. Gerald must have noticed the change in her demeanor because he leaned in, his voice quieter now. "I don't want you to worry, Mrs. Wilson. This can be handled, but we'll need to act fast. Brian is playing dirty, and we need to be prepared for anything. I'll start gathering the legal team, and we'll have this sorted out." Ellen's fingers tightened around the papers in front of her. "He forged my signature." The betrayal went even deeper than she thought. Her own flesh and blood, willing to go to such lengths to destroy her. But as the anger bubbled up inside of her, a new thought crept in, a thought that gave her a quiet sense of calm amidst the chaos. She had worked her whole life to build something, and Brian was not going to destroy it. Not without a fight. She wasn't going to let him win. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "No, Gerald," she said, her voice firm. "This isn't just about stopping him. It's about making sure he never tries anything like this again. We will expose him. We'll make sure everyone knows who he truly is." Gerald looked at her, surprised by the fire in her eyes. "You're sure? This could be messy." "I'm sure," Ellen replied. "It's time to stop playing nice. Let's bring this to an end, and make him regret ever thinking he could break me." As the weight of her words hung in the air, Ellen knew this was only the beginning. The battle for her legacy wasn't over, and Brian was about to learn just how far his mother was willing to go. Ellen's heart was pounding, but she didn't flinch. It wasn't the first time she had faced adversity in her life. In fact, it seemed like her entire life had been one long string of obstacles, some small, some seemingly insurmountable, but she had always found a way to overcome them. Now, facing her son's betrayal, she felt a cold fire burn inside of her. She wasn't going to let him win. Not this time. Gerald had left her with the files, the forged documents that Brian was using to destroy her. It made her sick to her stomach to see how low her son had sunk. To think that the boy she had raised, the boy she had given everything to, would go so far to tear her down. It was unthinkable. But it was happening, and Ellen had no choice but to fight back. As she sat alone in the house, the once comforting walls now felt like a trap. It was her sanctuary, yes, but it had become a battleground. Ellen couldn't just sit idly by anymore. She knew what she had to do. She wasn't going to let Brian win without a fight. And she wasn't going to let him drag her name through the mud. She picked up the phone and dialed the number of her lawyer. She had already spoken with him yesterday, but today, she needed to take matters into her own hands. It rang 3 times before he answered. "Mrs. Wilson," the lawyer said, his voice calm and professional. "I was expecting your call. I understand you've seen the documents Brian's presenting." "I've seen them," Ellen replied, her voice steady but tinged with anger. "And I'm not backing down. We need to expose Brian for what he's done. We can't let him get away with this." The lawyer paused. "I agree, but we have to be careful. If this goes public, it could get ugly. You don't want to be caught in the middle of a scandal. It might not be as easy as we think." Ellen felt her blood boil, but she kept her composure. She wasn't afraid of Brian, and she wasn't afraid of his threats. She had lived through far worse in her life. "I'm not afraid of a scandal," she said firmly. "I'm afraid of letting him get away with what he's done to me. What he's doing to this family. I want him exposed for who he really is." The lawyer let out a sigh. "We can do that, but you need to be prepared. We'll need to move fast and make sure the legal team is ready for whatever comes next. Brian won't back down easily. He's got resources and he'll fight dirty." "I know," Ellen said, her eyes narrowing. "But I've got a few tricks up my sleeve too." The conversation ended, and Ellen was left with a sense of resolve that she hadn't felt in years. She was no longer a victim in this situation. She was a fighter, and she wasn't about to let Brian destroy her. She spent the next few days gathering everything she could, meeting with the lawyer, looking over her late husband's files, and preparing herself for the legal battle ahead. She knew the odds were stacked against her, but for the first time in a long time, she felt in control. She had the truth on her side, and that was something Brian couldn't take away. But just as Ellen was beginning to feel like she had a handle on everything, something unexpected happened. It was a Saturday afternoon when the knock came. This time, Ellen didn't recognize the voice on the other side of the door. Her first instinct was to ignore it. She wasn't in the mood for another confrontation with Brian or his goons. But something in her gut told her to open it. She unlocked the door, cautiously, and pulled it open just a crack. Standing there was a woman she'd never seen before, holding a briefcase in her hand. "Mrs. Wilson?" the woman asked. Her tone was formal, and her eyes were sharp, almost calculating. "Yes," Ellen replied, her voice guarded. The woman smiled, though it was more of a thin, practiced gesture than anything warm. "I'm Angela Phillips. I'm Brian's lawyer." Ellen's heart skipped a beat. She had been expecting something like this. She had known that Brian wouldn't sit idly by while she fought back. But she hadn't expected it to happen so quickly. Angela held up the briefcase, but Ellen didn't take it. "I've come to deliver a message from my client. Brian wants to settle this without going to court. He's offering you a deal." Ellen raised an eyebrow. A deal? She didn't trust Brian as far as she could throw him, but she needed to hear what this lawyer had to say. If nothing else, it would give her more ammunition for the fight ahead. "What kind of deal?" Ellen asked, her tone skeptical. Angela's smile widened, though it still didn't reach her eyes. "Brian is willing to drop all claims on the property and the estate. In exchange, he wants you to sign a document that gives him a small percentage of the assets. It's a fair deal, one that ensures you won't face any legal repercussions for your actions." Ellen's mind raced. This was it, Brian's way of trying to regain control without fully backing down. He was offering her a deal in exchange for a piece of what was hers. But it wasn't just about the money. It was about power. And Ellen wasn't about to give up her power so easily. "Tell Brian," Ellen said slowly, "that I don't make deals with people who think they can bully me into submission. He can take his offer and shove it." Angela's eyes narrowed, and she stepped back, but her voice was cold. "You'll regret this. Brian won't back down. He'll expose everything, and you'll be left with nothing." Ellen wasn't shaken. She had been through worse, and she wasn't about to let this woman intimidate her. "I'm not afraid of his threats," Ellen replied, slamming the door in Angela's face. As the door clicked shut, Ellen stood there for a moment, her breath steady, but her heart racing. She had made her decision. There was no turning back now. Brian would have to learn the hard way that his mother wasn't someone to be trifled with. The days that followed felt like a blur to Ellen. She had made her decision, and now there was no going back. Brian's threats no longer carried the weight they once did. Ellen had spent years living under the shadow of his manipulation, always giving in to his demands, always putting his needs ahead of her own. But not anymore. This time it was different. She was done playing the victim. The next morning, as Ellen sat at the kitchen table, reviewing the legal documents with Gerald, the weight of what she was about to do hit her fully. Brian had tried to force her into submission, to make her feel small and powerless. But what he didn't realize was that she had spent her entire life preparing for this moment. She was not going to back down. She was going to fight, not just for the estate, but for her dignity. "This is it," Gerald said as he placed the papers on the table in front of her. "We'll file these with the court today. Once they're in motion, Brian won't be able to stop it. This will be a public record, and there's no taking it back." Ellen nodded, her eyes scanning the documents. The legal team had crafted a solid case, but there was more at stake than just money. This was about everything that Brian had stolen from her over the years: her peace of mind, her trust, her relationship with him. Now, it was time for him to face the consequences. She signed the papers, her signature firm and confident. As the ink dried on the page, a sense of finality washed over her. She was ready. She was prepared to take the next step, whatever it took. Gerald gathered the documents, his face a mix of respect and caution. "I'll take these to the court, Mrs. Wilson. We'll move fast, but I want you to be aware. Once this becomes public, things will get messy." Brian will fight back, and it won't be pretty. Ellen sat back in her chair, her hands clasped together in front of her. "Let him fight," she said, her voice steady. "I'm not afraid of him anymore." As Gerald left to file the papers, Ellen stood up, walking over to the window that overlooked the backyard. The same yard where Brian had locked her away just days ago, thinking he had won. The same yard where she had decided to take back control of her life. She looked out at the garden, now silent and still. It seemed like the calm before the storm. But Ellen wasn't afraid of the storm. She had weathered worse in her life, and she knew that. No matter how hard Brian tried to make her feel small, he could never take away her strength. Not anymore. A few hours later, Ellen's phone rang. It was Gerald. Her pulse quickened as she answered. "We've filed the documents," he said, his voice grim. But Brian has already made his move. He's hired a private investigator, and he's going to do everything in his power to dig up dirt on you. He's trying to paint you as unstable, trying to undermine everything we've just filed. Ellen's jaw tightened. Of course, she thought. He's going to fight dirty. "Let him," she said, her voice low but unwavering. "It won't matter. He's playing a losing game." Gerald paused, then sighed. "I hope you're right, but you should be prepared. Brian's got connections. He's not going to back down. This could get ugly." Ellen didn't respond right away. Instead, she sat back, looking at the framed photos on the wall of the living room. Pictures of her and Henry, her children, the holidays they'd shared. She thought back to the years when everything had been simple, when her family had been close-knit, before the jealousy, the greed, and the lies had started to tear them apart. As the memories washed over her, Ellen felt something shift inside her. This fight wasn't just about money or property. It was about reclaiming everything that had been stolen from her. Her peace, her voice, her worth. She stood up, feeling a sense of resolve settle in her bones. "I'm not afraid of his threats, Gerald," she said quietly. "I've been through worse, and I'm still standing. Brian can try all he wants, but I won't break." Gerald's voice softened, and Ellen could hear the respect in his tone. "You're stronger than most people realize, Mrs. Wilson. But remember, this won't be easy. You'll need to stay strong." "I will," Ellen said, her voice steady. "I've waited a long time for this moment. Now it's time to show him what happens when you mess with the wrong woman." As Ellen hung up the phone, she knew that the battle was far from over. But she had taken the first step, and she wasn't going to stop now. Just as she set the phone down, there was a knock at the door. Ellen's heart skipped a beat. She had no idea who it could be, but she was ready. The past few days had taught her that no one, least of all Brian, could walk over her again. She opened the door, and standing there was a man she didn't recognize. He was tall, with dark hair and a stern expression. But what struck her most was the envelope he held in his hand. "This is for you," the man said, his voice curt. "It's from Brian." Ellen's stomach twisted. Whatever it was, it couldn't be good. She took the envelope from him, her fingers shaking slightly as she opened it. The letter inside was brief, but the words jumped out at her. "You think you've won? I'll make sure you regret ever turning against me. This isn't over. Not by a long shot." The letter ended with a legal threat, a warning of the legal consequences she would face if she didn't back down. Ellen's eyes narrowed as she read the letter. This was his last-ditch effort to intimidate her, but it was too late for that now. She crumpled the letter in her hand, her gaze hardening. She wasn't going to let him destroy her.
Not now.
Not ever. With one final glance at the man at her doorstep, she slammed the door shut. This time, there would be no more games. No more pretending. She had already won. Brian just didn't know it yet. The tension was thick in the air, and Ellen could feel it in the pit of her stomach. She had already made up her mind that this fight with Brian would not be over until it was finished, and she would make sure it was finished on her terms. The day after receiving Brian's legal threat, Ellen spent hours preparing herself. She pored over the trust documents again, reading through every line, making sure that every legal loophole had been covered. Her lawyer had reassured her that she had done everything right, but Ellen couldn't help but double-check. She wasn't taking any chances. Brian had made his move. Now it was time to counteract it. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from Gerald. "I've spoken with the court. We've pushed up the hearing date. It's in 2 days. Be ready." 2 days. Ellen couldn't believe it. She had barely had time to process everything that had happened over the past week, and now she had to face Brian in court. But there was no turning back. The moment she had signed those papers, everything had changed. She was no longer the passive, silent mother she had once been. She had made her choice, and now it was time to face the consequences. Her heart pounded in her chest as she walked to the living room, glancing at the pictures of her children that adorned the walls. Memories flooded back, sweet, bittersweet memories of the times when they had all been a family, united by love. But those times had been long gone, replaced by the greed and manipulation of Brian, the son she had given everything to. The son who had now threatened to destroy her life for his own gain. Ellen stopped in front of the window and gazed out at the garden. The roses Henry had planted all those years ago were still there, blooming brightly in the sun. For a moment, she closed her eyes, letting the warmth of the sun wash over her. Henry had always been her rock. He had believed in her in their family. But Brian? Brian had taken everything he had built and turned it into a battlefield. But she wasn't going to back down.
Not this time.
The sound of the doorbell ringing brought her back to the present. She stood up, taking one last deep breath before walking to the door. Her nerves were taut, but her mind was clear. She knew what had to be done. She opened the door, and standing there was a man she didn't recognize. He was well-dressed, in a sharp suit, and carried a briefcase. He gave her a polite smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Mrs. Wilson?" he asked, his voice smooth and professional. "Yes," Ellen replied cautiously, her hand resting on the door frame. "I'm Peter Harris," he introduced himself, holding out his hand. "I represent your son, Brian." Ellen's stomach turned. Another lawyer. Of course, Brian would try to escalate things further. She shook his hand briefly, but she didn't invite him inside. "What do you want?" Peter smiled again, this time with a hint of condescension. "I'm here to discuss the terms of the settlement." Ellen's eyes narrowed. A settlement? She had already made it clear that there would be no settlement. "There's no settlement, Mr. Harris. I've already made my decision." Peter's expression faltered for a moment, and he seemed to shift gears. "Your son has made it clear that he's willing to do whatever it takes to make sure this all gets resolved. He's willing to offer you a financial arrangement to make sure there are no further complications. It's a generous offer, Mrs. Wilson." Ellen could barely contain the laugh that bubbled up inside her. Generous? The only thing Brian was offering was a way to buy his way back into the house he thought he owned. She stood her ground, her voice firm. "Tell Brian that his offer is nothing more than a bribe. I'm not interested." Peter hesitated, then glanced down at the briefcase he was carrying. He opened it and pulled out a document, sliding it across the doorframe to her. "This is the final offer, Mrs. Wilson. If you don't accept it, things will get worse for you. You've seen what Brian is capable of." Ellen took a deep breath. The words "worse for you" echoed in her mind. She had heard that threat 1,000 times over the years, first from her husband's business partners, then from her children's friends, and now from her own son. But this time, she wasn't afraid. She reached down and took the paper, scanning it quickly. It was full of the same threats, the same demands for money and control. But what struck her wasn't the content of the document. It was the sheer arrogance behind it. Brian thought he could buy her silence, buy her submission. He thought he could use money to control her just like he always had. With one fluid motion, Ellen crumpled the paper in her hand and threw it back at Peter, the force of it landing at his feet. His eyes widened in shock. "You tell Brian," Ellen said, her voice cold, "that I'm not for sale, and that his threats don't scare me anymore. Not now, not ever." Peter stood there for a moment, his face a mask of disbelief. Then he slowly bent down, picked up the crumpled paper, and put it back in his briefcase. "This isn't over, Mrs. Wilson," he said, his voice low and threatening. "Oh, I think it is," Ellen replied, her gaze unwavering. "But you're welcome to try." Just don't make the mistake of thinking I'll back down." With that, she closed the door in his face, locking it behind her. She had been pushed into a corner for far too long, and now she was ready to strike back. The clock was ticking. The court date was fast approaching, and Ellen knew that Brian would do whatever it took to make her back down. But no matter what happened next, Ellen was prepared. She wasn't just fighting for money. She was fighting for her dignity, for her future. And she wasn't about to let anyone, not even her own son, take that from her. The days leading up to the court hearing were like a pressure cooker, the tension thick in the air. Ellen could feel the weight of it all, the pressure to hold strong, the need to stay focused, and the unsettling realization that the fight she was about to face would change everything. She had already given up her quiet life. Now, she would have to face her son in court, knowing that every word, every action, would define the rest of her future. The night before the hearing, Ellen sat alone in the living room, the soft glow of the lamp casting shadows across the room. The papers she had signed, the ones that had set this whole chain of events into motion, were now a physical representation of her resolve. They were more than just documents. They were a symbol of her strength, of the woman who had finally found her voice. She ran her fingers over the edges of the papers as the memories of Brian's betrayal flooded her mind again. She had spent years taking care of him, guiding him, loving him. She had sacrificed so much, all for him. And now he was willing to throw it all away for few more dollars, for control over something that wasn't his to take. She had given him everything, and now she would take it all back. A knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. It was nearly 10 at night. Who could it be? Her heart raced, but she knew she couldn't show any signs of weakness. With a steady hand, she opened the door, her eyes locking onto the man standing in front of her. It was Gerald, her lawyer. "I need to speak with you," he said quickly, his face grim. Ellen stepped aside, letting him in. She could tell from the look on his face that something was wrong. "What is it?" she asked, her voice calm but tinged with worry. Gerald took a seat, pulling a manila envelope from his briefcase. "I've just received some troubling news," he said, handing her the envelope. "Brian's legal team has managed to get an injunction to freeze your assets temporarily. It's a standard move, but it could delay the proceedings. They're trying to prevent us from accessing the estate." Ellen's breath caught in her throat. She had expected this kind of dirty tactic from Brian, but hearing it out loud made her blood run cold. He was going to try to starve her out, to make her feel powerless by tying up everything she had worked for. "How long can they keep it frozen?" Ellen asked, her voice steady despite the rising anger inside her. "It could take weeks, possibly months, depending on how the judge rules. They've filed it under the guise of protecting the estate from further disputes, but it's all part of Brian's strategy to pressure you into settling," Gerald explained, his face tight with frustration. Ellen clenched her fists. She wasn't going to back down. She had come too far to let this slip through her fingers. "So, what do we do?" "We have to act fast. We can request a hearing to challenge the injunction, but we'll need to prove that Brian's actions are not in the best interest of the estate. It's a battle, but it's one we can win." Ellen nodded, her mind already calculating the next steps. "Then let's do it. We're not giving him an inch." Gerald gave her a long look, clearly impressed by her determination. "I'll get the paperwork filed tomorrow. We'll get this in front of a judge as soon as possible." Ellen stood up, her resolve hardening with every passing moment. "Brian thinks he can outsmart me, but he's wrong. This is my life, and I won't let him steal it from me." Gerald smiled slightly. "I've always known you were tough, Mrs. Wilson, but this is going to be a fight. Are you sure you're ready for what's coming?" Ellen turned to face him, her expression unwavering. "I've been ready for years." As Gerald left, Ellen sat down once again, this time with a manila envelope in her hands. She looked at the documents inside, her heart pounding as she realized that the battle had truly begun. But she wasn't afraid. She wasn't going to be the one who crumbled this time. The next morning, the courthouse loomed in front of her, its cold stone walls a reminder of how much was at stake. Ellen's hands trembled slightly as she walked up the steps, but it wasn't fear that made them shake. It was anticipation. She was about to face Brian, the son she had raised, the son who had torn apart their family for greed. She entered the courtroom, taking her seat at the plaintiff's table. Brian was already there, sitting with his lawyer, looking as smug as ever. His eyes caught hers across the room, and for a moment, she saw the familiar flicker of arrogance. But Ellen wasn't going to let that arrogance break her. The judge entered, and the proceedings began. Brian's lawyer stood first, outlining their case. It was the same old song and dance. Brian's lawyer claimed that Ellen had manipulated the estate, that she had tricked her son into giving up his rightful inheritance. They had their documents, their forged signature, and a story full of lies and half-truths. But when it was Ellen's turn to speak, the courtroom fell silent. She stood up, her heart pounding, but her voice strong and unwavering. "I have lived my entire life giving everything I had to my family," she began, her voice steady. "I've worked hard, raised my children with love, and done my best to teach them right from wrong. But somewhere along the way, my son lost his way. And now, he's trying to take everything I've worked for, all in the name of greed." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. Brian's eyes flickered with discomfort, but he didn't speak. "I will not stand by and let him destroy everything we've built. This house, this estate, it's mine. Not because of some signature on a piece of paper, but because I've poured my blood, sweat, and tears into it for decades. And I'm not going to let anyone, especially my own son, take it from me." The courtroom was silent. Ellen's words echoed in the room, and for the first time in what felt like a long while, she felt in control. She had given Brian a lifetime of love, and now it was her turn to take back what was rightfully hers. The judge leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "We will reconvene tomorrow," he said. "But it's clear that there are deeper issues at play here than simple inheritance. This case is far from over." As Ellen sat back down, she felt the weight of the moment. The battle was far from won, but it had just begun, and she wasn't about to let Brian win. The courtroom was packed with tension. The buzz of hushed conversations filled the air as everyone waited for the judge to enter. Ellen sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her gaze unwavering as she stared ahead. The sound of footsteps echoed through the room, and the judge entered, his robe sweeping the floor behind him. As he sat at the bench, the silence grew deeper. It had been a long and exhausting week, but Ellen was determined to see it through. After days of back-and-forth arguments, motions, and counterclaims, she finally felt like she was standing on solid ground. No matter what happened in this courtroom, she had fought the fight that needed to be fought. Brian had not backed down either. His lawyer had spun every tale they could muster, trying to paint Ellen as manipulative, unstable, and desperate for control. They brought up every flaw they could find, twisting her life into a web of deceit in front of the judge. But no matter how hard they tried, Ellen's resolve remained unshaken. She had spent her whole life building something, working, sacrificing, raising her children with the belief that love and trust could overcome anything. But now, it seemed the only thing left to build was her legacy, and she was going to protect it with everything she had. The judge cleared his throat, signaling that it was time for the final ruling. Ellen could feel her heart pounding, but she kept her face calm. She had been through worse in her life. This was nothing compared to the struggles she had faced before. And whatever came next, she would face it head-on. After reviewing the evidence, the judge began, his voice steady, and considering the arguments presented, it is clear that this case involves more than just a financial dispute. This is about a family, trusts, inheritance, and the integrity of familial relationships. Ellen held her breath. The words felt like they were suspended in time, and she couldn't quite make sense of them. Was the judge about to rule in her favor, or was Brian going to find a way to claim everything? I find that there are significant discrepancies in the documents provided by the defendant, particularly the alleged forgery of Mrs. Wilson's signature. This is a serious violation of trust and law. Based on the evidence before me and the testimony I have heard, I am ruling in favor of Mrs. Wilson. A wave of relief washed over Ellen, but it was mixed with disbelief. She had won. She had actually won. The fight wasn't over yet, of course. There would be appeals, there would be legal wrangling, but the judge had spoken. Her son's claims had been proven false. The estate, the house, everything she had worked for was hers. She could see Brian's face fall, the smug arrogance replaced by confusion and anger. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The years of manipulation and threats had finally caught up with him. But Ellen wasn't done yet. The victory wasn't just about the estate. It was about the truth, the exposure of who Brian had become. "Your Honor," Ellen stood, her voice strong, unwavering. "This ruling is just the beginning. But I want to make one thing clear to my son. This isn't just about the house or the money. This is about respect. You've taken everything from me over the years. You thought I would bend, that I would break. But I didn't. And I won't." The judge looked at her with something close to approval in his eyes. "You've shown a great deal of strength throughout these proceedings, Mrs. Wilson. I hope that your son learns from this and realizes that what he's done is not only legally wrong, but morally reprehensible." Brian's face had gone pale. He shot a quick glance at his lawyer, but even his lawyer seemed to realize that there was no way out. The game was over. Ellen walked out of the courtroom with her head held high, her heart still pounding with adrenaline. She had done it. She had won. But as she made her way out of the courthouse, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, glancing at the screen. It was a message from Gerald. "The injunction on the estate has been lifted. You have full control again. It's all yours. No one can take it from you now." Ellen let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. It was over. She had won the battle. But now, she was finally free. Free from the years of manipulation, free from the chains that Brian had tried to put around her. As she stepped outside into the bright sunshine, Ellen felt something shift inside her. It wasn't just relief. It was a sense of liberation. She had fought for everything she had, and now, she was taking her power back. She looked up at the sky, the clouds drifting lazily by. For the first time in years, Ellen felt the weight of the past lift from her shoulders. It wasn't about the house or the money anymore. It was about the life she had fought to keep. But there was one more thing she had to do. She called the one person who had always stood by her side, the one person who had never once doubted her. Her daughter. "I did it," Ellen said when her daughter answered. "I won. The estate is mine, and Brian is going to have to live with the consequences." Her daughter's voice cracked with emotion on the other end of the line.
Mom,
"I knew you could do it. You're stronger than all of us. You always have been." Ellen smiled, tears welling up in her eyes as she looked at the house in front of her. The house that had been the setting for years of love, heartbreak, and betrayal. But now it would be hers again. And this time, no one would take it from her. As she stood there, the weight of the battle finally beginning to fade, Ellen realized something. This wasn't just about the house or the money. It was about reclaiming her voice. It was about standing up for herself, for her life, and for everything she had built. Her strength, her resilience, her love for her family. They had all brought her here. And now, Ellen Wilson was finally free.